Hi, everybody. Welcome to the TESS seminar. We're going to start now. I've been really excited about this seminar, actually. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Maxine Newlands from JCU and Dr. Michelle Dyer from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Authority, who are speaking today for us from Townsville. So hi, guys, and thanks so much for coming. Really looking forward to the talk. And
Thanks,
I think
Yoko.
oh yes, you can hear me. Thank you.
Yep, can you hear us okay?
Perfect.
Great, thanks very much for that. Yes, so this is going to just be a fairly casual presentation about a body of work that we did around stewardship in the reef and what does stewardship really mean. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge, of course, country and the land in which we are on, the Bindal and Woollgabburra peoples, and the land in which we work, and of course up in Cairns and across the reef space. So this project was a combination of JCU and Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority with Michelle Dyer, who will be in the second half of this presentation. Michelle's the Assistant Director of Social Science in the Science for Management Department here at Garumpa. As Yoko said, I'm Maxine Newlands. I'm also a social scientist, and I am a work in political science in the College of Arts and Science and Education at JCU. And then our other authors is Erin Bradshaw, who is at Monash University, and Steph Hernandez, who's currently working in forestry in New South Wales, but at the time we put this report together, she was also on the social science team at Garumpa, and I believe is a JCU graduate. So that's the team behind this. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to kind of introduce things, set up the rationale, and talk about the sort of muted. There we are. Hello. Can you hear us?
Hi, Max. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, thanks, Tracy. Okay, I'll keep going then. So as I was saying, this report, we're going to do a sort of double header presentation. So the rationale for the report really came from a couple of two related sources and the conversations that we've all had with probably half the people on this line and you've had amongst yourselves. Really, what is stewardship when it comes to the Great Barrier Reef? And one of the thinkings behind this was, it's like words, for me personally, it's like words such as, sustainability. There's a lot of informal information and sort of that looks both academic and grey literature that uses the term stewardship. And as we found, and we'll show you, doesn't actually define stewardship. What does stewardship mean, particularly in the reef space? And so we found that this was quite problematic. And the other thing we realized as well, that there was a kind of a dearth, if you like, of evaluation or outcome linked information. So effectively, the stewardship is being done without a definition or without a clear definition in the GBR space, but that stewardship is not being evaluated. So we don't, because there's no definition, it's hard then to kind of go, well, how do you measure that, if you like? So that was some of the reasoning behind into this study. The other thing was a simple kind of anecdotal, what does stewardship mean? And they say this is a term that's often used around, sort of sustainability. I had a conversation yesterday with someone about what does participation mean and how do you measure that? So we really wanted to kind of look at this correlation between how the term is used, how it's applied, what does it mean? Does it mean different things to different organizations? And that's something we definitely found out. And more specifically, what does it mean within the reef context? And even more specific than that, what does stewardship in the reef context mean for management? So understanding what stewardship means from a management perspective can then be used to help with decision-making processes. So really, these are the sort of conversations that we were having in order to try and establish, well, what does stewardship mean? So we did the classic. We obviously did a literature review. And because we were aware of the kind of lack of nuance, for want of a better term, of how stewardship was being used within the reef space and the sort of the different interpretations by different groups. We looked at the literature both from academic perspective, but also we tried to look at grey literature as well. And really the key thing for this is that there's lots of literature, both grey and academic, which is about stewardship. And stewardship, as I say, in different interpretations. But what is it when it's talking about the Great Barrier Reef? What is the kind of information that relates specifically to the GBR? So this is really where we were coming from when we were doing our literature review. And I'm just going to take you through that process in a second before we get to the results, in order to see, is there a difference? Is it used in a different way when we're looking at the Great Barrier Reef as opposed to maybe other areas or even other countries? So, really wanted to kind of nut out what was that idea, with the purpose being that if we couldn't find a definition or a clear, succinct definition of stewardship, then maybe when it comes to the GBR specific, then there's something there that we can make a definition of stewardship in order to go through the processes, say, about evaluation and measuring and so on and so forth. And so what our objective with the literature review, or one of the objectives, was to propose a typology, if you like, a set of categories that stewardship falls under. And we had a very long list, which we have narrowed down, which we'll show you later on. So really that was the kind of thinking behind the process. So we followed a two-stage process, of course, to develop the tools for both classifying and evaluating this sort of conceptual and definitions of stewardship, both, as I say, in the academic literature and also the grey literature. Sorry. And my able assistant is just trying to be clever and just press the wrong button. Hang on.
I was trying to get rid of the thing, but I can't. Sorry.
She's trying to move the notes thing down. I'll just do it. Hang on. There we go. So what we began doing was that, as you can see here with the method, we've got the, we looked at all the academic sources. So we did all the normal things, we looked at Web of Science, we looked through Crowcrest, which we then rejected. We looked through Google Scholar, all the usual kind of suspects, if you like, but we were looking for specific barrier reef GBR stewardship academic literature, and that's where we found there wasn't a huge amount, as we'll show you. But we also wanted to see when we were building this typology, if you like, these categorizations, we wanted to see how it was being used potentially outside of the GBR and also in non-academic literature. So we used this systematic review to publish peer review literature, and we also then sourced using a snowball sort of collection of grey literature, which was not necessarily peer reviewed, but was using the terms stewardship and was in some ways defining stewardship. And that was what we found was things like there's a lot of brochures, a lot of flyers, there were technical reports like we've written, but I'm stealing. But there were some things out there, but not necessarily GBR specific. So once we've done that, then we did a qualitative thematic analysis. So we used the results in order to understand how the term stewardship is being used within the context of the reef specific. And that way we were then hoping to develop our kind of what is the type of stewardship efforts that's going on. So once we'd got that, we looked at what is stewardship in the GBR. And then, of course, we went there. You can see here sort of managing sustainable use and public engagement were two of the sort of themes that started to emerge. And then what we wanted to do then was, instead of just going, well, here's a definition of a kind of mishmash of other things, we wanted to start building a conceptual framework, which Michelle will talk to. So just to give you a bit of background, we included everything published from the 2010 until the 2019. So this took quite a long time, this study. The reason 2010 is there and anything was excluded was when we did those Google searches and those Web of Sciences, you see there's a bit of a spike from then onwards. Of course, we included GBR specific, and we didn't put in marine generally, we excluded. Activities that were land-based but not directly about reef health. So of course that's that's one of the key objectives of the authorities around reef health. So that was sort of to make sure it was in but not land-based. things like in English, no language, so on and so forth. And the other one that's worth mentioning in both this and the grey, which I'll show you in a second, was that we got a lot of hits from the term stewardship when it came to like the Marine Stewardship Council, and particularly when it came to like fisheries, and that would have really skewed the data. So we excluded those as well, both in the first slide, in the academic literature, and also in the grey literature. So because it really was around fisheries, and that's why, and we felt it was too much of a focus also around traditional owner knowledge as well. So these were the exclusion reasons in the grey literature, and because we excluded that, we actually got a very small sample of just 5 in the grey literature that were GBR specific, of which only 4 had an actual definition. So what were our scope and our limitations? Well, some of the limitations were actually because we were restricted to reef specific. So as I say, there was lots of the term stewardship, but not specifically within the GBR space. So if the literature referred to activity in the reef catchment, but not specifically about reef health outcomes, that was also excluded. A general sort of broader selective review of general literature on stewardship was undertaken for context and comparison to find out how the term might be used outside of the GBR. But again, that was not included in the analysis in order to form a really clear picture of what reef-specific stewardship looks like in both the grey and academic literature. Now, that's not to say that this isn't something that we'll go back to, or someone else may want to look at this. So further work could broaden this scope to include many of these activities that are taking place both in the catchment and, of course, within the broader region. As I said, the review of the grey literature, for the reasons I've just given, was also limited in this report, and we're aware that the figure is low. Articles were included in review only if they use the term stewardship. And of course, that was the whole objective. Well, what does stewardship mean when it comes to the GBR? And we also don't address issues of scale, either social or environmental. So finally, the literature, we actually came out with 13 academic articles that were within all those parameters that I've just explained. And as I say, grey literature, we only came out with 5. So, I mean, that's there's further research to be done there and to look into why, we know roughly why, because we excluded quite a lot, but there's more work to be done there. We definitely excluded the term stewardship, but no actual stewardship content. So you'll be amazed how many we found that actually went, oh, we're doing stewardship, and then was never mentioned again, defined or explained. So they were excluded from the group, from the sample as well. As I say, fisheries, brochures as well. And we didn't try and find things that also might be stewardship, but didn't use the label stewardship. Okay, so now we're just going to do a quick chair swap, and Michelle's going to give you the findings.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Max. So yeah, I'm just going to pick up where Max left off here. And as she said, we ended up with a very small sample size, which to our mind reflected actually how often the term was used, but not very, how indistinctly the term stewardship has been used. And this is just the headline findings from the literature. Stewardship was being used to describe a few different things, and the main categories of that was motivation, capacity and action. And you would find these not used together to describe stewardship, but often in different articles using just one of these concepts and calling it stewardship. And when we compared the non-GBR literature on stewardship to our very specific GBR stewardship document set, we found a really stronger management focus in our small sample size. So I'll just pull these findings apart a little bit for you. We looked for definitions of stewardship in our sample, and we only found 4. Articles actually defined stewardship. 3 were academic articles and 1 of the grey literature sources. So from the grey literature, we found stewardship with a 2-part definition, one about values, stewardship as being a value that people hold, and then the second part was how these values and attitudes translate to action. And within our academic literature, we had 3 articles that defined stewardship. And those definitions were mostly about attitudes to the environment and to conservation. So as you can see from the text there, sorry about the heavy text, but I thought I would just give you the definitions. It's about how people feel about the environment, and some there in the second definition talking about action, but really more about how people feel. So what we then did in our analysis of the document set was look for concepts of stewardship. And from the broader literature, we found that there are 3 main concepts of stewardship. So nature conservation, so just looking after, well, not just, but looking after the environment as in and of itself. Secondly, for sustainable development, so maintaining an ecosystem function, and mostly in terms of what that does for people in a sustainable way. And then there is also concepts that combine the 2 of those. So we attributed one of these concepts of stewardship to our document set. And this is what we found, that in the grey literature, 4 of our samples had a concept of stewardship as nature conservation, 7 as academic, only 1 grey literature source as sustainable use, and none in the academic. And the reason for that really is that we took out the Marine Stewardship Council certification for fisheries, because in this GBR space, that's where most of the sustainable use was occurring. And then in the academic, there was a mixture as well, so both nature conservation and sustainable use. So we did a thematic analysis then using in vivo, and what we found initially, we had 60 initial themes, which we consolidated into 11 final thematic categories, which were activity, behaviour, governance, communication, methodology, research, industry, social, place, theory, and nature. So that sounds like a really weird list, but basically in the thematic analysis, what that came down to was this is what the articles were mostly focusing on. And we got to this final 11 with inductively from the higher order grouping of the initial 60 themes. So we explored similarities between the themes across the entire document set using Pearson's correlation coefficient, which is a statistical measure that determines the association between the variables of interest, in this case, the themes that we coded our sample with. And we found that the most commonly related themes were methodology and activity, and also communication and behaviour. So this relates to the document focus in our document set. So when we were coding a lot for methodology, it was most often linked with an activity, and when we found an article was really focused on communication, it was linked with behaviour change. So what this really showed us from the thematic analysis perspective was that the literature was focusing on different components of stewardship, not always together, but everything just had a blanket label of stewardship. And just the headline findings from our thematic analysis there up on the screen. Communication is linked to outreach and behaviour change, and causal links were actually hard to find. So while there was a lot of talk about motivation and building capacity, it was mostly hypothesised or assumed that this led to environmental outcomes or on-the-ground action, and there wasn't much empirical evidence for that. And I'll show you in the next slide, there is a suggested disconnect in our Pearson correlation coefficient between social and natural research. So when we found that there was an increase in the term nature, we found a corresponding decrease in the coding for social and vice versa. So, and I think this points to something that we know we want to address, which is a disconnect between the social research and natural research outcomes for stewardship. So in our literature set, half of the sample described results that were environmental outcomes, and a really strong finding from the GBR specific sample set was 85% of the articles were coded with the theme management, which is probably not surprising given our management environment of the GBR. And then you can see the next finding there, 69% of the articles were coded with Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And just the last point there, which is quite important, even though the writing's tiny, was that only three of the articles contained program logic linking the stewardship activity to environmental outcome. So, as I said in the previous slide, mostly those links were hypothesized or assumed, and that was when we started some of the impetus for actually doing this study in the first place. Oh, what's happening here? Something funny with my slide. And just out of interest, we also put all of Grabumpa's annual reports into NVivo and just did a word frequency search for the term stewardship, just to see, you know, when this term came into vogue and its kind of fluctuations. And as you can see from the graph there, it really started to get popular in the mid 2010s, and it's starting to taper off again. So that's just for interest's sake. So just going to change tack a little bit here and show you a framework, a stewardship framework that we just have made minor kind of adaptation to for the GBR context. So this is a conceptual analytical framework by Bennett et al. And the framework seeks to understand local environmental stewardship just defined as action. So the focus of the framework is components of stewardship activity, the context in which they happen, the actors that do them, the elements of actor motivation and capacity, then type of action and social ecological outcome. So we like this framework. We didn't undertake a heavy critique of it. We feel like it contained all the components that we were seeing in the GBR specific case. And our point of difference here is that in this framework, only actions are considered stewardship. So everything else in the purple and the blue boxes there falls into things that support stewardship or the context of the stewardship action. So these, some of these efforts will be considered indirect stewardship. So the motivation and capacity boxes, they call indirect stewardship, and just anything that falls into the green box as actions, that's labelled stewardship. So the reason this is relevant is that in our document set, management activities were typically coded with what Bennett et al. Describe as indirect stewardship activities. So indirect stewardship activities in their framework were supporting activities like environmental education of resource users, transmission of traditional ecological knowledge, which we didn't cover in this review, network building activities, environmental governance or policy reforms, systems of reward and punishment, so, you know, incentives for doing the right thing and sanctions for doing the wrong thing, and academic or participatory monitoring and research. So that would include things like citizen science. So the reason we draw this out is because a lot of what we found in our GBR specific document set was related to that list of activities that I've just given you, but in the Bennett framework, that would be that would not be called stewardship, that would be called indirect stewardship activities. And the reason we thought this was a problem is that, this is our suggested definition that we found in our document set, that stewardship had three components, and they were create or strengthen motivation for caring for the reef, a capacity, so that's training, building capacity to care for reef health, and then actions for reef health. So that was our three component definition. And what we hypothesized is that the reason that we found so little focus on outcomes of activities labelled stewardship was this disjuncture between a definition of stewardship only as action and then actually a whole lot of activities that fall into these other categories, which are people's motivations, which is an actual capacity, ability, skill level, agency to care for the reef, that then enables you to actually carry out that action. And of course, this also relates to the problem of establishing causality, because while you might know that somebody has a desire to do something to the reef, how do you know if your stewardship activity that has helped strengthen that or create that motivation then leads to a specific action? So causality is quite difficult. And in the Bennett framework, we felt we needed to tweak it a little bit, just because if you talk about indirect stewardship, it's hard to draw that direct line then to environmental outcomes. So from here, taking our thematic analysis to create this three-part definition, we then went to try to think about a typology of reef stewardship, so how we would categorize these things. And we created this typology by cross-referencing, clustering and comparing our definitional components with our thematic coding outcomes in the small reef-specific data set. And we suggest this typology as a very reef-specific typology of stewardship, and we recognise that it doesn't encompass all stewardship efforts definitively for all time in the Great Barrier Reef, but rather there is an overlap between categories, and it's expected that greater innovation and understanding over time where we can expand the range of efforts within and between categories. So what we've got, the elements of this typology, is that the conceptual framework sits along a spectrum of stewardship means and ends. So that's the arrow along the bottom of the diagram. And ends refers to outcomes, protecting reef values, both social and ecological. And we see the means then as encompassing the full spectrum of stewardship activities described by our three-component definition. And then the real point of this, our so what factor, is to more accurately label and articulate these components of stewardship so that we can actually measure if we're moving towards stewardship outcomes. So, for example, in our document set, we found that people would do an education campaign and it would be a hypothesized or an assumed outcome would be stewardship environmental outcome. But there was no evaluation actually of, well, what did you want the education campaign to achieve? And then did you achieve that thing? And how does that take us towards a desired social environmental outcome for stewardship? So we're just trying to set up a way that we can have better articulation of our stewardship components for evaluation purposes to see, are we doing what we want to do? Is it producing the outcomes that we want it to produce, or is it actually producing something else? And then the final, because there is, if you're just looking at a change in motivation, what good is that for us in terms of a reef health outcome if it doesn't result in the desired action? And I'm sure people can argue that there's good in that of its own, and that's a social outcome as well. So I also, just before we finish, wanted to point to this study, which we didn't actually use in our review, but it was just interesting to find this study. This is from Stewardship as a Boundary Object, and I really like this diagram because it shows that intersection of ethic, motivation and outcome. So the same components of our framework as well, but just linking there, just showing there how thinking through the meanings of these things and how they're centered around these three dimensions of care, knowledge and agency. So I just wanted to point you to that. And our remaining questions that came out of doing this work was that we need to understand causal links between stewardship motivation and stewardship action. How do we measure if a stewardship activity that aims to influence attitudes and cultivate stewardship motivation is successful? And what are the connections between education and awareness about environmental issues and change behaviour or direct action towards better human-environment relationships? So I know there is work out there that is addressing this stuff. Some of our colleagues in the social science for the reef space addressing some of this work, and we really found these were the unaddressed questions in a lot of the work we reviewed. So that was all we had for you today. Contact details for both of us. I might stop sharing and we can open for questions.
Yeah.